Static dreams. The static began not as an invader, but as a native tongue. For Alara, it was the very fabric of the unconscious, the primordial soup from which dreams were supposed to coalesce. It wasn't the gentle, lulling blackness most people described. It was a roaring, monochrome chaos, a billion points of gray and white and searing black, buzzing with a sound that was less a noise and more a physical sensation, a vibration that started in her teeth and hummed down into the marrow of her bones. She was 10 years old when she first tried to explain it to her parents. They stood in her doorway, backlit by the hall light, their faces soft with concern that was already hardening into a kind of practiced dismissal. "It's just snow, honey," her father had said, a smile in his voice. "Like on the old TV in the basement when the antenna broke. Just tune it out." But you can't tune out a universe. Every night, Alara would lie down, close her eyes, and be swallowed by the roar. For years, it was formless. Then, around her 16th birthday, the shapes began to form. It started subtly. A darker patch in the swirling gray would resolve, for a fleeting second, into the profile of her mother. Not her mother as she was now, but a younger version from a photograph Alara had seen in an album, her hair in a style long since abandoned. The shape would hold for a heartbeat, a silent, grainy ghost before dissolving back into the noise. Another night, it was the family dog, Buster, who had died when she was 12. He emerged from the static, not as a whole dog, but as a series of fragments, a twitching ear made of flickering lines, a lolling tongue of pure white, a dark, liquid eye that seemed to stare right at her before the chaos reclaimed him. These were the static dreams. They were never in color. They were never silent, though the roar of the static would sometimes dip, allowing other sounds to bleed through, a fragment of a forgotten song, the distant echo of a slammed door, a whisper that was more texture than word. Her waking life began to feel like the intermission. She moved through school, through family dinners, through conversations with friends, with the persistent sensation that she was merely killing time, waiting to return to the true, if terrifying, work of the night. The real world seemed oversaturated, garish in its clarity. The dream world, for all its horror, felt more authentic, more densely packed with meaning, even if that meaning was encrypted in noise. She started a journal. At first, it was just a few scrawled lines upon waking. Saw Grandpa's hat, heard a lullaby. But as the forms became more persistent, more complex, her entries grew longer, more desperate. She tried to sketch the things she saw, but her pencil could never capture the frenetic, living quality of the static. The figures weren't solid, they were made of the chaos, their edges bleeding signal and decay. "It's just your brain defragging," her friend Maya had said once, trying to be helpful. Processing the day's data. But Alara knew it wasn't that. The faces she saw weren't from yesterday. They were from the edges of her memory, from the dusty attic of her childhood, and some from places she was sure she had never been. The night it changed, the night the barrier thinned, began like any other. transition from wakefulness to the static was seamless, a slow crossfade where the sight of her bedroom ceiling, the faint glow-in-the-dark stars she'd stuck there as a child now dull with age, was gradually overwritten by the boiling gray. The roar settled into its familiar frequency. Tonight, the static felt different. It was thicker, more purposeful. The random dance of pixels began to cohere, not into a single figure, but into a scene. It was a room, a living room. She recognized the floral pattern of a sofa, the dark wood of a console television, the very one her father had compared her dreams to. It was her grandmother's old house, a place she hadn't visited since she was 6, before her grandmother passed away. The memory was a hazy, sun-drenched thing in her mind. But here, in the static, it was rendered in stark, high-contrast monochrome. The image flickered and jumped, as if the broadcast was unstable. And in the center of the room, a figure solidified. It was a man. He was tall and thin, dressed in a suit that was so dark it was a hole in the static. His face was a smudge of lighter gray, featureless, except for 2 dark points where his eyes should be. He stood perfectly still, facing her, and Alara felt a cold dread that was entirely new. This wasn't a fragmented memory. This was a presence, an intelligence. The static around him began to form other shapes. Toys on the floor, a wooden duck on wheels, a rag doll. The doll's stitched smile, rendered in static, seemed like a grimace of pain. The man did not move, but Alara felt his attention like a weight. He was waiting. Then the sound dipped. The roaring static faded to a distant hum, and in its place, she heard it clearly. A child's laughter, her laughter, from a long, long time ago. The man in the static tilted his head, and the dream ended, not with a gradual fade, but with a violent snap. Alara's eyes flew open. She was in her bed, in her room. The digital clock on her nightstand glowed 3:17 a.m. The fear from the dream was still upon her, a cold sweat coating her skin. She tried to sit up, to throw off the covers, to turn on the light. She couldn't move. A leaden paralysis held her fast. It was as if her body had been filled with concrete. Only her eyes could dart around the room, taking in the familiar shapes of her desk, her chair, the curtained window. Her breath came in shallow, ragged gasps. She tried to scream, but her throat was sealed, her jaw locked. This was sleep paralysis. She'd read about it, a glitch in the waking process where the brain's motor functions are still offline. Knowing what it was did nothing to diminish the primal terror. And then she heard it. A low, steady, S-H-H-H-H-H-H-H-H-H-H-H-H. It was the sound of her dream, the sound of the static. It wasn't inside her head. It was in the room. Her eyes, wide with panic, scanned the darkness. The sound was emanating from the corner, near her old, disused dresser. There, in the deep shadows, the darkness itself seemed to be swarming. It was a patch of pure, living static, a 3-dimensional cloud of black and white noise, humming that same bone-deep frequency. As she watched, frozen in her bed, the cloud began to move. It drifted from the corner, hovering a few inches above the floor, a malevolent fog. It left no trace on the carpet, made no sound of movement beyond its own eternal roar. It moved toward her bed. Alara's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird in a cage of stone. She strained against the invisible bonds, every muscle screaming in protest, but she was utterly, completely trapped. The cloud of static stopped at the foot of her bed. It began to change. The formless noise swirled and coalesced. The familiar, grainy shapes began to form. It was the man from her dream, the tall, thin man in the dark suit. He stood at the foot of her bed, a figure composed of television, snow, and shadow. His featureless face was pointed down at her. The two dark pits of his eyes felt like voids, sucking all the light, all the hope from the room. He raised an arm. The arm was not solid. It was a cascade of flickering pixels, a shimmering outline. Slowly, impossibly, the hand reached for her. It moved through the air, not like flesh and bone, but like a bad signal, stuttering and jumping slightly. It came closer, closer, until the buzzing, staticky fingers were mere inches from her face. Alara could feel the vibration on her skin, a million tiny pinpricks of energy. She could smell it, the scent of ozone, of hot electronics, of dust burning on a vacuum tube. The staticky fingers hovered there, not touching her, but feeling her, probing the space around her. She felt a pressure against her mind, a cold, alien presence rifling through her thoughts, her memories. It was a violation more profound than any physical touch. And then, as suddenly as it began, it was over. The figure dissolved back into a formless cloud of static. The cloud shrank, pulling in on itself, and then, with a final, soft pop of dead air, it was gone. The paralysis broke. Alara shot upright in bed, a choked sob finally escaping her lips. She scrambled backward, pressing herself against the headboard, her eyes fixed on the empty space at the foot of her bed. The room was silent. The only light was the faint green glow of the clock. 3:18 a.m. It had lasted a single minute. It had felt like an eternity. She didn't sleep again that night. She sat huddled in her bed, every shadow a potential swarm, every faint noise from the house the precursor to that terrible shhhhhhh. When the sun finally rose, painting her room in weak, morning light, the event felt distant, dreamlike. But the memory of that staticky hand, hovering inches from her face, was etched into her with the clarity of a brand. This was no longer just a dream. Something had crossed over, and she knew, with a certainty that chilled her soul, that it was only the beginning. The archaeology of static. The days that followed were a blur of exhaustion and paranoia. Alara went through the motions of her life, attending classes, talking to her parents, trying to laugh with Maya. But she was a ghost in her own world. Her real life was now the nocturnal one, a desperate battle on the shifting sands between sleep and wakefulness, between memory and nightmare. She became an archaeologist of her own past, spurred by the appearance of her grandmother's living room. The static was pulling from her memory. She needed to understand the source material. She spent hours in the basement, digging through old cardboard boxes filled with photo albums, home movies on VHS tapes, and her mother's forgotten keepsakes. She found the photograph of her mother with the old hairstyle. She found a picture of Buster, tongue lolling. And she found a whole series of photos from her grandmother's house. There was the floral sofa. There was the console television. And in one picture, a group shot of a family gathering, stood a tall, thin man in a dark suit, her great uncle Albert, who had died when she was 3. The photo was grainy, his features soft, but the resemblance to the static man was unmistakable. A cold knot tightened in her stomach. The static wasn't just creating monsters, it was reconstructing the dead. The sleep paralysis became a regular occurrence. 2, sometimes 3 times a week, she would snap awake into that petrified state. And the static was always there. It didn't always form the man. Sometimes it was the rag doll from the dream, its static form dragging itself across the floor with a horrifying, jerky motion, its stitched smile now a rictus of malevolence. Other times, it was a swarm of what looked like static insects, buzzing around her head. Once, it was the face of her 4th grade teacher, Mrs. Davison. But her kindly features were stretched and distorted, her mouth opening and closing silently, spewing clouds of gray noise. Each time the entity would approach, would probe the space around her with its buzzing, non-touch, and then retreat. Each time, the feeling of violation deepened. It was studying her, learning her. Her journal entries became frantic, coded, filled with sketches of the things she saw. October 14th, the man again. Closer this time, felt the cold, memory, great Uncle Albert's funeral, Mom crying. I was wearing a scratchy black dress. October 21st, the doll. It crawled onto the bed. Its hand was on my leg. I felt the vibration through the blanket, woke with a bruise. Coincidence? It has to be. October 29th, not sleep, wide awake, 3 a.m. The static came from the mirror. My reflection, it was made of static. It smiled at me. I didn't. Her waking life began to show cracks. She saw flickers of static in her peripheral vision, a glitch in the air, a patch of visual noise that vanished when she turned her head. The sound of rain on the roof sounded, for a terrifying moment, like the roar of her dreams. She was becoming unmoored, the barrier between her 2 realities wearing dangerously thin. Maya noticed. Alara, you look like death warmed over. What's going on? Is it the dreams again? They were in a noisy coffee shop, a place that should have felt safe and normal. Alara clutched her warm mug, her knuckles white. How could she possibly explain? Oh, you know, the usual. Dreaming in TV snow, being visited by a static phantom, who may or may not be my dead great uncle. And by the way, I think it's starting to physically interact with my world. Instead, she said, just not sleeping well. Nightmares. Maya leaned forward, her face serious. Have you thought about seeing someone? A therapist. My mom saw one for her anxiety, and it really helped. A therapist. The idea was both tempting and ludicrous. What would she say? That she had a recurring dream about a bad television signal. They medicate her, tell her it was stress. They wouldn't understand that the static wasn't a symptom, it was a place. And something from that place was now making house calls. Maybe Alara lied, taking a sip of her coffee. The liquid was tasteless. All she could focus on was the fluorescent light above their table, which was flickering slightly. Its buzz, a pale imitation of the sound that haunted her. That night, she decided to fight back. She was a scientist in a lab of one, and her own mind was the experiment. She set up her laptop on her nightstand, its camera pointed at her bed, recording. If it was all in her head, the video would show a girl thrashing in her sleep. But if it was, she fell asleep with difficulty, her body tense with anticipation. The static welcomed her as always, but tonight it was different. It was agitated, angry. The forms that emerged were sharper, more aggressive. She saw the man, but he was not still. He was packing in the static room, his movements jerky and fast, like a film on fast forward. The rag doll was beating its head against a static wall, over and over. The child's laughter from her memory was now a high, frantic shriek of terror. She was ejected from the dream by the familiar sensation of concrete pouring into her limbs. 3:17 a.m. Her eyes opened. The paralysis had her, and the static was already there. This time, it wasn't in the corner. It was standing right beside her bed. The man. He loomed over her, his staticky form blocking out the light from the window. The roar was deafening, filling her skull. He leaned down. The buzzing, pixelated face came close to hers. The two dark eye pits were bottomless. She could see the individual points of noise that composed him, swirling and dying, and being reborn in an endless, chaotic cycle. He raised his hand. This time, he did not stop. The staticky fingers touched her forehead. A jolt, like a powerful electric shock, seared through her. It was not a pain of nerves, but of memory. Her mind was flooded with images, sounds, sensations, all rendered in screaming black and white. A birthday cake with 6 candles, the flames flickering like static. The smell of her grandmother's perfume, lavender and dust. The feel of sun-warmed grass on her bare legs. The sound of an argument downstairs. Muffled, angry voices. A fall from a swing. The sharp pain in her wrist. The taste of dirt. A closet door dark. The sliver of light from underneath. The feeling of being small, so small, and hiding. The memories were hers, but they were distorted, corrupted. The happy ones were tinged with dread, the sad ones amplified into trauma. It was as if the static was rewiring her past, overwriting her life with its own malevolent code. The pressure in her head intensified. She felt something give. A memory long buried, hidden behind a wall of childhood amnesia, broke through. She was 4 years old, in her grandmother's living room. The console television was on, but there was no show, just static, a blizzard on the screen. She was alone in the room, fascinated by the noise, the movement. She walked closer to the screen, her small hand reaching out. The static seemed to reach back, tendrils of light and shadow curling out from the glass, beckoning her. She pressed her palm flat against the warm screen. The static clung to her skin, crawling up her arm. She felt a pull, a tremendous sucking force. She was being drawn into the TV. She tried to scream, but the sound was swallowed by the roar. And then a hand, a real human hand, grabbed her from behind and pulled her back. It was Great Uncle Albert. His face was pale, terrified. "Never," he whispered, his voice shaking. "Never touch the snow, Alara. It's hungry." The memory exploded in her mind with the force of a bomb. It was true. It had always been true. The static wasn't in her, she was in the static. She had touched it, and a part of it had touched her back. It had been with her all this time, sleeping inside her, and now it was awake. The man's hand pulled away from her forehead. The influx of corrupted memories ceased, leaving her mind reeling, a scrambled mess. The staticky figure seemed to solidify. The flickering became less erratic. The features on the smudged face became slightly more defined. It had fed. It had grown stronger. For the first time, it made a sound that wasn't the universal roar. A voice, synthesized from 1,000 broken signals, layered with noise, and the ghosts of old broadcasts emerged from it. It was a single word, spoken in a dry, buzzing rattle. "Mind." Then it was gone. The paralysis released her. Alara curled into a ball, sobbing, clutching her head. The memory of that childhood event was now vivid, clearer than any other memory she possessed. The fear, the pull, her great uncle's warning. She stumbled out of bed and went to her laptop. Her hands trembled as she opened the video file from the night. The timestamp showed 3:17 a.m. The video showed her, lying rigid in bed, her eyes wide with terror. And then it showed the static, a shimmering, impossible distortion in the air beside her bed, resolving into a humanoid shape, leaning over her, touching her. The microphone had picked it up too, the overwhelming shhhhhhh. And beneath it, that distorted, electronic whisper. Mine. It was real, undeniably, horrifyingly real. She had her proof, and she knew, with a sinking certainty, that proof was useless. No one would believe this video. They'd call it a hoax, a digital artifact, sleepwalking. They couldn't feel what she felt. They couldn't understand that the static was a dimension, a predator, and she was its chosen prey. It had tasted her memory. It had claimed her. And it was not going to stop until it had consumed her entirely, pulling her back through the screen into the endless, hungry snow. the signal and the noise. The world outside her window now seemed like a fragile illusion, a poorly transmitted broadcast that could turn to snow at any moment. Alara moved through her life as a sleepwalker. The memory of the static hands touch a brand on her skin, the echo of that single word, mine, a constant refrain in her mind. Her research became an obsession. She abandoned her schoolwork, spending her days in the library or scouring the nascent internet on her family's slow dial-up connection. She wasn't looking for sleep disorders anymore. She was looking for ghosts in the machine. She found fragmented accounts on obscure forums, stories lost in the digital noise. A user named Static Ghost wrote about his grandfather, a TV repairman who claimed certain old sets, especially those with vacuum tubes, could act as resonators for phenomena they didn't understand. Another, white noise witness, described a similar experience of childhood static dreams that culminated in seeing a fuzz person at the foot of her bed. Her post was from 1995, and there were no follow-ups. It was all circumstantial, maddening, but it was enough to confirm she wasn't entirely alone. This phenomenon, had happened to others. The question was, what had happened to them? Had they, like her, continued to be haunted? Or had they eventually been taken, pulled into the snow, their stories ending with a final, silent post? She remembered her great Uncle Albert's warning. It's hungry. What did it feed on? Memory, fear, attention. She was a living antenna, tuned to its frequency, and every time it visited, the signal grew stronger. The visits intensified. The paralysis was now a nightly expectation. The man was always there, sometimes with his silent court of static shapes, the doll, the insects, the distorted faces of her past. Each touch was longer, more invasive. Each time, it siphoned another piece of her history, corrupting it and leaving behind a hollow, staticky echo. She found herself forgetting simple things, her locker combination, a friend's birthday, only to have them replaced with a vivid, monochrome memory of, say, a forgotten trip to the zoo, now tainted with the image of the animals having static for eyes. She was being edited. Her life was being remastered in the key of static. One night, the assault changed tactics. The paralysis took hold, the static cloud formed, but it did not create the man. Instead, it coalesced into the image of her father. It was a perfect replica, down to the mole on his cheek and the faint smile lines around his eyes. But it was made of flickering gray and white. Alara, it said, and its voice was a perfect imitation of her father's warm, concerned tone. But beneath it, like a carrier wave, was the ever-present hum. Honey, are you okay? You look so tired. The horror was somehow worse than the monstrous forms. This was a perversion, a mockery of love and safety. The static father reached out a buzzing hand to stroke her hair. She recoiled internally, her soul screaming, but her body remained stone. We're so worried about you, it continued, its head tilting. Maybe you should come with me. We can get you help. Just come into the static. It's quiet here. It's peaceful. The hand moved from her hair to her cheek. The vibration was nauseating. It felt like lying, given physical form. All your fears, all your pain, we can erase it. We can make it all smooth. The face began to distort, the features sliding, the smile stretching too wide. Just let go, Alara. Let the signal carry you. It was a siren's song, offering an end to the terror. The temptation to just surrender, to stop fighting, was a palpable force. She was so tired. But then she saw it. In the depths of the static father's eyes, the two dark pits remained. The voids, the hunger. This was just another lure. With a Herculean effort of will, she focused not on the comforting words, but on the underlying noise. She leaned into the roar, the shrieking, chaotic dissonance. She remembered the cold, alien intelligence, the feeling of violation. This was not her father. This was the thing that was eating her alive. She focused all her energy, all her fear and rage, into a single, silent thought, projecting it at the entity. No, the static father's face contorted in rage. The kindly features dissolved into a shrieking mask of pure noise. The roar escalated to a deafening shriek, and the figure exploded back into a formless cloud, which then imploded into nothingness. The paralysis broke. Alara gasped, her body drenched in sweat. She had won that round, but it was a Pyrrhic victory. She had rejected its offer of a peaceful consumption. She had shown it she would fight. She knew what would come next would be worse. The next day, she went back to the basement. She needed to know more about Great Uncle Albert. If he knew about the static's hunger, he must have encountered it himself. She found a box labeled Albert's Things, tucked away behind the Christmas decorations. Inside were a few old books, a stamp collection, and a leather-bound journal. Her hands trembled as she opened it. The handwriting was spidery, frantic. August 12th, 1963. The signal is stronger tonight. It speaks in voices from the radio, voices I have never heard. It shows me places I have never been. It is a universe of noise, and it wants a doorway. September 3rd, 1963. I have confirmed it. The old sets are the key. The tube, the cathode ray, it creates a resonance, a puncture. I fear I have stared into the puncture for too long. It has stared back. October 31st, 1963. It tried to take Sarah today, my little niece. She was watching the snow, mesmerized. I pulled her away just in time. Her eyes, they were full of it. I saw the static in her eyes. I have damned her. I have damned us all. November 15th, 1963. It is not a ghost. It is not a demon. It is something older. A presence from the spaces between channels, from the null signal. It is anti-memory. It consumes stories and leaves only noise. Final entry, December 1st, 1963. It has my shape now. It walks in my skin of light and shadow. It calls to me from every screen, every blank wall in the dark. I cannot fight it much longer. I must break the resonator. I must shatter the tube. It is the only way to close the door. Forgive me, Sarah. Forgive me. Alara closed the journal, her heart pounding. It was all here. Her great uncle hadn't just known he had been a victim, a fellow traveler in this nightmare. He called it the signal. He believed old televisions were resonators that could thin the barrier. And he believed he had passed this curse to his niece, Sarah, Alara's mother. Her mother, did she know? Had she been haunted too? Alara thought of her mother's sometimes sad eyes, her aversion to having a television in her bedroom, her tendency to jump at sudden, loud noises. Had she fought her own battle and simply lost? Had she buried the memories so deep they became a part of her? A quiet, static-shaped sadness at her core. It was a lineage of terror, passed down through a family, not by blood, but by a shared glance into the hungry snow. That night, Alara didn't go to her room. She went to the basement, to the old console television, the source, the resonator. It sat under a dusty white sheet, a hulking piece of furniture from a bygone era. Her hand shook as she pulled the sheet away. The dark screen was like a monolith, a blank eye. She plugged it in. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a slow, warm glow and a low hum, the vacuum tubes inside began to power up. The screen remained dark. Then, a single, bright dot appeared in the center. It began to spread, a blooming flower of black and white noise. The familiar shhhhhhh filled the basement, louder and more potent than it ever was in her dreams. This was the source, the wellspring. She stood before it, as she had when she was 4 years old. The static danced and swirled, and within it, she saw the familiar shapes. The man, the doll, and now new shapes, the static father, the face of her childhood self, contorted in a silent scream. It was all here, her entire haunted life reflected in the noise. The man in the static stepped forward until his form filled the entire screen. He pressed his hands against the glass from the inside. The screen bulged slightly, the glass groaning under a pressure that was not physical, but dimensional. The roar was no longer just a sound. It was a voice, 1,000 voices, all speaking at once in that synthesized, broken rattle. You are the door. You are the receiver. It is time to come home. The glass of the television screen began to crack. A spiderweb of lines spreading from where the static hands pressed. A cold wind, smelling of ozone and decay, blew from the set. The pull was immense, the same force she had felt as a child, magnified 1,000-fold. It was pulling her soul from her body. This was it, the final incursion. It wasn't going to be satisfied with visiting her in her room anymore. It was going to pull her into its world, to be lost forever in the endless, screaming static. The null signal. Alara felt her feet leave the ground. wasn't a physical levitation, it was a severing. The connection between her consciousness and her body was stretching, thinning, like a television signal at the edge of the broadcast range. The roar of the static was no longer outside her. It was inside, filling the empty spaces in her bones, the silent chambers of her heart. The world around her, the dusty basement, the boxes of memories, the single bare light bulb overhead began to durez, its colors bleeding away, its edges softening into a blur. She was being unmade, digitized, prepared for ingestion. The cracked television screen was no longer a window, but a mouth, a vortex of howling nothingness. The man's form had dissolved back into the chaos, but his presence was everywhere, the conductor of this symphony of erasure. The other shapes, the doll, the faces, the insects, swirled around the edges of the vortex, a shrieking chorus urging her on. Home, the voices boomed. Come home to the noise. Her great uncle's journal had said it was anti-memory, a thing that consumed stories. And she realized that was the truest horror. It didn't just kill you. It deleted you. It took the narrative of your life, the loves, the losses, the mundane moments, the profound truths, and overwrote it with its own endless, repeating, meaningless pattern. To be pulled into the static was to have your very soul scrambled into entropy, to become just another flickering ghost in the machine, a fragment of a scream lost in the eternal blizzard. She couldn't fight the pull. It was too strong. It had been building for a lifetime. But as her vision narrowed to a tunnel focused on the screaming screen, her hand, acting on an instinct deeper than thought, flailed out, knocking against the heavy wooden side of the console television. Her great uncle's final entry flashed in her mind. I must break the resonator. I must shatter the tube. He had known. The television wasn't just a window, it was an anchor, a focal point. It was amplifying the signal, giving it a bridge into her world. To break the TV was to break the bridge. With a final, desperate surge of will, she redirected the energy. Instead of fighting the pull, she used it. She let the force of the static yank her forward, but she twisted her body, throwing her weight against the massive console. It was solid, heavy, old-world craftsmanship. It barely budged. The voices shrieked in dissonant laughter. The pull intensified. She could feel her thoughts beginning to scatter, her memories dissolving like sugar in water. Maya's laugh, the smell of rain, her mother's hand on her fevered brow. They were being replaced by a burst of white noise, a sustained, high-pitched tone, the flicker of a test pattern. No, she screamed, but her voice was a wisp of static. She threw herself against the TV again. This time, her hand found the channel dial. A stupid, futile gesture. She turned it. The static on the screen flickered. For a fraction of a second, it resolved, not into a clear picture, but into a different kind of noise. A rolling, horizontal distortion. The pitch of the roar changed. It was vulnerable. The act of tuning of changing the channel was an act of will against its monolithic presence. It was a reminder that the static was just one state among many. Emboldened, she grabbed the dial and cranked it wildly. The screen erupted in a chaos of jumping lines, rolling frames, and fragmented images caught between stations. A sliver of a cartoon, a flash of a news anchor's face, a moment of color bars. The signal screamed in outrage, its unified voice breaking apart into conflicting frequencies. The pull lessened just for a moment. It was enough. Alara stumbled back, her eyes scanning the cluttered basement. Her gaze fell on her father's old workbench. There, among the hammers and wrenches, was a heavy steel pry bar. The vortex on the screen was restabilizing, the chaotic channels resolving back into the unified, hungry static. The man was reforming, his arms outstretched, ready to pull her in. She didn't think, she acted. She lunged for the pry bar, her fingers closing around the cold, greasy steel. It was impossibly heavy, but adrenaline lent her strength. She hefted it, turned, and with a cry that was part terror, part fury, she swung it at the television screen. The sound was cataclysmic. A shattering of glass, a crunch of plastic, a fizzing, popping scream of dying electronics. A shower of sparks erupted from the console, and the roar of the static cut off with a final, agonized snap of silence. The pull vanished. Alara fell to the concrete floor, the pry bar clattering beside her. The sudden quiet was more deafening than the noise had been. She lay there, gasping, her body trembling with shock. She looked up at the television. The screen was a jagged, black hole. Thin tendrils of smoke curled from the shattered picture tube. It was dead, truly dead. A wave of profound exhaustion washed over her. She had done it. She had broken the resonator. She had closed the door. For a long time, she just lay on the cold floor, waiting for her heart to stop hammering, waiting for the ghost of the static to fade from her ears. When she finally found the strength to stand, her body ached as if she had been beaten. She climbed the basement stairs on unsteady legs, each step feeling like a mile. She emerged into the living room. The digital clock on the VCR glowed 4:02 a.m. The house was silent and still. She walked to the kitchen, poured a glass of water with shaking hands, and drank it down. The water was real. The coolness on her tongue was real. The smooth surface of the counter under her fingertips was real. She had won. She went to her room and collapsed onto her bed, not even bothering to take off her clothes. For the first time in months, she fell into a deep, dreamless, and utterly silent sleep. The afterimage, the peace lasted for a week. 7 blissful, static-free days and nights. Alara slept through the night, a heavy, restorative sleep. The paralysis did not return. The flickers in her peripheral vision ceased. The world regained its saturation, its sharp edges. She started to feel human again. She told her parents, The console TV had shorted out and sparked, so she had unplugged it. They'd been concerned about the fire hazard and had simply hauled it to the curb for trash pickup. Alara had watched it go with a mixture of relief and a strange, lingering sadness. It had been a prison, but it had also been a part of her family's history. She began to catch up on schoolwork. She went to the movies with Maya and actually laughed. A real, unforced laugh that didn't feel like a performance. She started to believe that it was truly over. The thing, the signal, had been anchored to the old TV. With its resonator destroyed, it had lost its hold on her world. But the human mind is not a slate that can be wiped clean. It is a palimpsest, with old writings forever visible beneath the new. The static had been writing on her for too long. The first sign was a dream. Not a static dream, but a normal, colored dream. She was in her grandmother's garden, but in the corner of her eye she saw it. A single black and white flower, its petals a shimmering field of television snow. It was small, isolated, but undeniably there. She woke with a knot of dread in her stomach, but she dismissed it. Just a remnant, a psychic scar. It would fade. Then she was in class, taking a history test. She was concentrating hard, and for a moment, the page of her notebook shimmered. The lines of blue ink seemed to writhe and break apart into tiny, crawling pixels before snapping back to normal. She blinked, and it was over. She wrote it off as eye strain. The final straw came on a rainy Saturday. She was home alone, reading a book. The rain was a steady, soothing patter on the roof. Then, a particularly heavy downpour began. The sound changed from a patter to a roar. A roar. Her heart stopped. She froze, the book forgotten in her lap. It was just rain. It was just rain on the roof. But her body didn't believe it. Her pulse skyrocketed. Her breath came in short gasps. A cold sweat broke out on her forehead. It was a panic attack triggered by a sound that was, to anyone else, utterly mundane. She sat there, paralyzed not by sleep, but by memory. The fear was as real and as potent as it had ever been in the depths of the night. The static was gone, but the terror it had cultivated was alive and well, a self-sustaining entity living inside her. That night, she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. She was afraid to sleep, afraid of what she might dream, afraid that the silence itself was just the static holding its breath. And then she saw it, not in a dream, not in a state of paralysis, wide awake. On the blank, white wall opposite her bed, a patch of darkness began to swarm. It was small, no larger than her hand. A patch of living, breathing static. It didn't form a shape. It didn't reach for her. It just was. A hole in reality, patched over with noise. It lasted for only 5 seconds before fading away, leaving behind only the memory of its presence and the faint, ghostly scent of ozone. Alara didn't scream. She didn't cry. A cold, grim understanding settled over her. She had not destroyed the signal. She had only severed its primary connection. She had been its point of focus for so long, her mind so thoroughly tuned to its frequency, that she had become a resonator herself. The door was closed, but she was the crack under it. The broadcast was off the air, but she was the receiver that couldn't stop picking up the ghost of the transmission. She had won the battle. She had shattered the anchor. But the war was not over. The static was in her blood, in her neural pathways. It was a part of her now, a chronic condition, a haunting she would have to learn to manage for the rest of her life. She got out of bed, went to her desk, and opened her journal. She picked up a pen. Her hand was steady. She wrote a new entry. The static is not out there. It is in here. It is a memory, a fear, a part of my history that cannot be erased. I can fight it. I can build my own walls. I can focus on the color, the clarity, the real. But I must accept that sometimes, in the corner of my eye, in the silence between heartbeats, the snow will still fall. The dream is over. The vigilance has begun. She closed the journal. She did not return to bed. Instead, she sat in her chair, watching the wall where the static had appeared, and waited for the dawn. She knew it would be a long night, and that there would be many more like it. But she was still here. She was still Alara. And for now, that was a victory in itself. The static had her memories, it had her fear, but it did not, and would not, have the rest of her story. That she would write herself, one clear, defiant word at a time.